Good morning and welcome to our final meeting of 2024. Thank you for your participation with this important commission that has the responsibility of stewarding the financing of Virginia's early childhood care and education system. Let's start by taking roll. So as I call your name, please reply here if you are in the room. If you are attending by Zoom, please reply here and the location from which you are joining. Secretary Amy Guidera or Delegate Emily Gullison, obviously here. Secretary Brian Slater or Delegate Billy Reed. Here. Commissioner James Williams or Delegate. Thank you. Dr. Lisa Coons. Here. Senator Evan. Here. Senator Locke.
Here in Hampton for now.
Thank you. Senator Stanley. Senator Suderline.
Yes.
Delegate Bulova.
Here.
Delegate Cherry.
Yo.
Delegate Hayes. Delegate Campbell. Here. Delegate Coiner.
Here.
Ashley Allen. Belinda Astrop.
Here.
Ellie Bracey.
Eli, you were present.
Eli, perfect. Thank you. Jason Alkubi. Simon Fiscus.
Here, Madison, Virginia.
Shavika Frazier. Kathy Glazier.
Here.
Edmund Hughes. Sonia Jones.
Here, Rocky Mount, Virginia.
Welcome. Kristen Kane. Todd Norris.
Here.
Nicholas Palacio.
Here from Stanton, Virginia.
Stacy Parham.
Here.
Benita Petrella.
Here.
John Saleh.
Here.
Travis Staton. Gary Thompson.
Here.
Stacy Vance. Kevin Waddles.
Here.
Rachel Williams. Elizabeth Winkle. Well, thank you and welcome. It's important we get grounded and reminded in the responsibility of the charge of the commission, especially since this is our last day for 2024. So, as stated in section 2.2-208.1, the Commission on Early Childhood Care and Education. In recognition of the fact that early care and education of young children is linked to academic success and workforce readiness, the Commission on Early Childhood Care and Education is hereby established for the purpose of providing recommendations for and tracking progress on the financing of the comprehensive birth to 5 early childhood care and education system that provides stable, high quality early childhood care and education services for families who need them the most, empowers parents with choices that meet their needs and preferences, and supports both school readiness and workforce participation. The Commission is charged with setting a vision and making recommendations for financing the early childhood care and education system in the Commonwealth. So as a reminder, we submitted our yearly report on October 1st. So thank you to everyone for the extraordinary efforts in fulfilling this commitment. In today's meeting, we will work toward finalizing our discussions of attendance expectations. These discussions will be synthesized into another report that's due December 1st to the governor and the chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations, the Senate Committee on Finance and Appropriations, the House Committee on Commerce and Energy, the Senate Committee on Commerce and Labor, the House Committee on Education, and the Senate Committee on Education and Health. Since this is the final meeting for 2024, and we will likely not meet again until next spring or summertime, I do want to pause and acknowledge those members whose terms are ending. So I'm going to list them and then would love to give them a well-rounded applause for all of our appreciation. So Eli Bracey, Simon Fiscus, Sonia Jones, Kristen Kane, John Saleh, Stacy Vance, and Rachel Williams. Thank you so much for your time and service. We are so grateful for the perspectives you've contributed to the Commission's work and purpose. And I would like to now welcome our Commission Chair, Delegate Carrie Coiner, to provide an overview of our agenda and goals for the day.
Good morning, everyone. Before we get started today, I'd like to take the time to acknowledge Senator Frank Ruff, who passed away last weekend. We have shortened today's agenda so members can travel to his funeral in Clarksville this afternoon. While Senator Ruff was not a member of the commission, he was a true champion of Virginia's early childhood system. Through his leadership, the Tobacco Region Revitalization Commission became one of the first investors in Virginia's early childhood systems building efforts. And so we honor that legacy as we continue our important work, and I'd ask for just a brief moment of silence. Thank you. It's hard to believe our year of work is over. We have been, I think, one of the busiest commissions this year meeting. So I'm excited for today. One, because when I closed the door last night to the last trick-or-treater and turned the lights out, Feliz Navidad rang through my house. So my children are in full on being tortured by Christmas music. But I woke up this morning really excited about our last meeting because we've worked really hard and we have some great outputs to give to the General Assembly and to the governor this year. So I'm excited for our last meeting today. Again, I'd like to thank you all for your time, your effort, your expertise, and dedication to advancing the commission's work this year. Our monthly meetings have been interspersed with study group calls and extracurricular reading, and I'd like to thank everybody for giving their extra time and effort beyond our regular meetings here. Your dedication to this work is so commendable. So let's jump in to help us navigate today's work and deliver on the high expectations for this commission. I am pleased to welcome to the podium Elliot, because he's going to miss us, aren't you? As we're all in session, he really is. He's going to miss us. Really thankful that he's here from the Foresight Law and Policy, who will facilitate today's last meeting. It's all yours.
Well, thank you. Delegate Coyner's a little behind the curve because if she's only putting up Christmas decorations, we are already up to July 4th and putting up the bunting. And that is the speed at which this meeting is going to have to move because we only have 2 hours. So given our shortened agenda today, let me cover what we're going to go over. We are going to start things off with a report out from Study Group 4, which you heard on a couple of subjects at the last meeting. But one of the things that we're going to hear about today is an update on attendance expectations. We already heard about co-payment schedule and parental work requirements attendant to both the child care subsidy program and mixed delivery grant program. We're also going to get some new data from the Department of Ed that will help commission members understand attendance trends in publicly subsidized childcare and how changes to attendance expectations might impact the program. To close out our time this morning, we're going to again hear from Jenna Conway at VDOE, providing updates on our recurring requests about family demand and wait lists for the child care subsidy program and the Virginia Preschool Initiative. Despite the accelerated schedule, we will certainly have time for discussion and processing at your table, and then for brief report outs. Everyone has done a very good job of doing brief report outs in previous meetings. I'm sure we'll do that again today. Because we're going straight through, if anyone needs a break, bathrooms are down the hall. There are drinks there. There will be lunches coming at the end, which again, if you want to stay and eat or take with you after the meeting, you're welcome to do that. We do have, as you saw, a number of members participating virtually. So members of the staff team will be monitoring the chat, and that when we do discussion breakouts, there will be at least one virtual group. So we will wrap up as close to 12 as possible so that everybody who is going to the funeral can get on the road. But in order to keep things moving, let us start with Study Group 4. As a reminder, we held virtual meetings with the study group to not trying to come up with like specific recommendations of exactly what to do, but trying to process the issue a little bit and provide some feedback back to the legislature for purposes of its own work in the spring. So again, thank you so much to all the members who volunteered to participate. And in addition to commission members, there was staff support from the Department of Ed and also from VECF. So I would like to invite Delegate Campbell to report out on attendance expectations. And just a reminder for those of you, come on up. In this room, the cameras don't follow, right? Like it's not like when we were at the community college and the cameras could go anywhere. The camera is mostly focused here, so we will ask people speaking to come up to the podium. Delegate Campbell?
Thank you. You knew, right?
Yeah.
So good morning. Our study group number 4, we had some very candid and nuanced conversations around the attendance expectations for Virginia. Prior to the meeting, members received an issued brief that explained our current attendance expectations for the child care subsidy program, as well as the mixed delivery program. We also learned that there are differences in the attendance expectations of the two programs due to the regulations and funding streams. So for mixed delivery, this is funded with the state general funds, and then every effort is made through this team to contact parents when a child is out for 5 days, 10 days, but if they can't make contact, after 15 days, the child is considered to not be enrolled. CCS actually has a different expectation and attendance criteria due to the federal regulations. Currently, the CCSP program in Virginia is paid based on attendance, not enrollment. However, the slot is still occupied even if the child is not attending. And the regulations state that unless a parent loses their job, leaves the state, or increases household income beyond the eligibility limits, excuse me, families cannot be disenrolled except for during the annual enrollment period. As required by the federal government for fiscal year 26, the Virginia CCSP program will move from attendance-based payments and will be following to enrollment-based payments. We recognize that this is probably going to have its own logistical challenges. This is because, as we learned, there are a lot of complexities for reasons that children are not attending these programs. We're working right now on implementing a new attendance tracking system that's going to help us streamline some of these processes and help us better understand the attendance trends in these programs. The group agreed that as we discuss the attendance expectations, the goal is to always engage families and to serve the child. We also recognize that public dollars are scarce, so we want to ensure that every public dollar can be directed to a child and a family to use a slot. Ultimately, we agree that because there's a lack of data that would help us to make specific recommendations for attendance expectations, it seems premature to provide or recommend any specific legislative or budgetary changes. However, we do think that as this data becomes more available, that we should revisit this and we should look at the information to make sure that we are using the dollars properly and that we're making sure that we serve every child. As we continue to do this, we want to make sure that we're balancing the needs of the children and also of making sure that we're using our public dollars properly. So that was pretty much our report.
Thank you, Delegate Campbell. Is there anyone else from Group 4 who has anything to ask? Anything to add? All right. So while we don't have all the data we might want, we do have some meaningful data that can provide some useful context. And so I'm going to ask Jenna to come up and provide that.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Delegate. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jenna Conway, Deputy Superintendent for Early Childhood. We can move to the next slide, please. So I know you're going to be shocked to hear this, but I'm here today to present some data to you as to continue to shape and inform the decisions. What I'll cover today in 2 pieces is first talking about attendance, what we do know, and what we gathered in response to some of the queries raised by Study Group 4, and then briefly some updated data on what we know about parent co-payments. So this body asked for kind of thinking about co-payments along a scale and how you might create a hybrid of different models, and then some really important just-in-time updates on BPI enrollment, what we know about the CCSP wait lists, some other kind of requests about industry and other pieces, and then sort of what we have taken away across all of the various sources of data that we've shared with you over the last 4 months. Next slide, please. So one more, please. So as Delegate Campbell just alluded to, we know attendance is important. And although it won't necessarily enable us to add new slots to the 42,719 CCSP slots that we have this year, it will help us maximize existing slots. And we want to make sure, and why this was such an important topic for the study group, is that there's a couple of key points to, as we looked at all of this data, that we wanted to emphasize. So the first is we could probably spend, I'm sure Bedina knows this as an operator and others, all day talking about how many days does a toddler get sick, right? Like and we have a lot of different reasons, and everybody who has children has been through the trenches on that. But what is really salient is that our pre-pandemic attendance looks very different from today. And so assuming that there's not massive changes, and again, this is out of the COVID era where there was obviously, sort of quarantine periods, but that there is data from both K-12 and from childcare subsidy that suggests that the curve has shifted. And that has more to do with the adult practices than it does with, some kind of different disease transmission among young children. And so that's just kind of a really important point, number one. Number two is we also know we can combine the national data that suggests that when you have the opportunity to attend quality early childhood, whether that's childcare, preschool, or in a family setting, that kids do better in care and do better longitudinally. And so we know, as of this fall from VQB5, that 98% of our programs meet expectations. And then lastly, we have a wait list, right? And so it basically means that these slots are more valuable than ever before. And how do we think about a family that is not fully employing and using that spot when there are, as I'll share a little bit later, over 11,000 families on a wait list, right? And so it's kind of in this context, this is not just abstract. How many times does a baby get sick, right? How many people does it take to turn a light bulb? But is really in the context of where we are right now. And just so you know, there's not a ton of national studies on this, but those that have been completed for both preschool and schools and childcare in public-private settings show that there's some real positive returns around getting kids to come to care, reducing the barriers that might keep parents and guardians from bringing their kids to care. And it lasts. It's a durable effect, as you see on the studies on the page. 20% lower chronic absenteeism in kindergarten, and then even lower absenteeism into middle school. And as the parent of a sixth grader, having a child in middle school, anything you can do to make middle school work better, I would say is a pretty exciting finding. Next slide, please. So just a little bit, I won't read every slide because you've got this at your tables, but again, kind of just at a very high level, as Delegate Campbell alluded to, slightly different structures right now. Some of that has to do with history, some of that has to do with regulations. So CCSP is currently pay based on attendance, but we are required by federal law to shift to pay by enrollment by summer 2026. Right now, our compromise, because the prior biennial budget really wanted us to begin this shift to pay by enrollment, was to offer more paid absence days as a way to kind of flatten the payments and provide more stability and consistency for private providers. We will share some data today. The big caveat is our current attendance tracking system is very antiquated. It is as Commissioner Williams can attest, as we at VDOE can attest, and as parents who've used this system, I know we heard from Nicholas about this earlier in our work group. It's a real pain to use. You have to swipe every day. You have to call in an IVR. You have to have a landline to have the IVR. It really feels like a throwback to 1992, and it also provides not the most reliable data. The good news is we have a signed contract with Kinder System that other states use to do this, and this will allow us, as you see here, sort of to put more attendance information at parents' fingertips, right? In addition to providers, ability for families to do this on their mobile phones rather than having to keep track of this card, more discreet, and ultimately will allow us to basically do two things, which we've heard are really important. If we are required to do pay by enrollment by the law, but we also don't want to lose that incentive for attendance, having this attendance tracking is going to be really key, right? So that we can then track attendance in a way that we have to disconnect payments from that, right? Because of how the regulations work, but we can still have a rigorous system for tracking, monitoring, ultimately thinking about how we either encourage better attendance or, potentially, have kids and families be removed from the program. Next slide, please. So here's the data. Here's what we know. You've seen some of this data before at the bottom in terms of the chronic absenteeism. And I got to give a shout out to Delegate Bulova, who was like, wait, this was helpful to have the 21 to sort of current, but what about, pre-pandemic? And so we grabbed that for him at one of our commission meetings out at Reynolds, and then realized we needed to do the same for childcare subsidy. So there's sort of two ways to think about this. One is where the more extreme behaviors, right? Where again, if you think about a waitlist slot as a more scarce kind of commodity, like who is really not using this regularly, right? And kind of thinking about chronic absenteeism. That's also probably a proxy for who might have the sort of be facing some of these barriers, and we need to kind of address. The other one to look at this is the median number of paid absences. And this is more reflective of kind of, the middle, right? The average, not just those outliers. And so we brought both to you for childcare subsidy. So what this has, the sort of top chart has 4 columns here. And then the first numerical column has 2018 to 2019. This is sort of the number of kids that are chronically absent, the percentage, right? Because we serve far fewer kids pre-pandemic. And then the median number of paid absences for those children that are chronically absent. So just giving you a sense of kind of for those outlier kids and families, kind of how often, is this occurring beyond just being beyond that threshold. Then below that, this is not for the kids that are just chronically absent. This is for all kids participating in the program. This gives you their median number of paid absences. So what you see is, as you notice, on the one hand, we have improved from where we were. 21-22 is probably our worst year in terms of attendance. And yet we are still not where we are pre-pandemic. And so if you look at it again, look at the percentages rather than the raw numbers, because we're serving so many more kids, but almost 21% of kids were chronically absent. That was only 14% pre-pandemic. The median number of paid absences for those outliers, not significantly different, but still more, right? So kids are more chronically absent and they're missing more days than they were pre-pandemic. Similarly, even if you say, well, those kids are outliers, maybe there are health issues, maybe there are other extraordinary circumstances. If you look at the median number of absences, and this is for all kids participating in these years, you still see, although we look better in 2020, 2023, 2024, as compared to 21, 22, we are still not back to pre-pandemic. We're missing kind of the median number of paid absences, 11 as compared to 9 pre-pandemic. And so we think kind of really important to think about, okay, regardless of, we know that kids, little kids, right? And somebody who's asking about ages, it tracks pretty closely what you might imagine. Babies and toddlers with the immune systems they do or do not have. They're working, we're building those immune systems, miss significantly more than preschoolers, than school age. But we are just not where we were pre-pandemic in terms of making sure that we're reducing barriers for families and that kids are attending. And if you also reflect pre-pandemic, we didn't have the wait list we had as well, but we did have small wait lists. But so we just think it's really important that we think about what, even if we obviously we legally have to move a pay by enrollment, but what are the other sort of guidance efforts, sort of shifts that we can make in order to get, at a minimum, get back to where we were pre-pandemic. The chart on the bottom you've seen before, but just kind of gives you a sense, and you see the same age pattern in terms of as kids get older, generally speaking, they kind of attend more, at least in elementary school. And you just see that again, our chronic absenteeism is sort of roughly where, just a little bit above where kindergartners are, but that's now, right? Kindergartners were pretty low pre-pandemic. And you'd like to see something, again, that was closer to the 13.6% in the same way that you'd like to see for K-12, that 19.11 be closer to 12. So that's where we are. And again, thinking about kind of just the stark reminder that there's some work to be done to kind of shift that curve back to where we were prior to the pandemic. Next slide, please. When it comes to mixed delivery and BPI, Delegate Campbell spoke to this, but just, kind of trying to make sure for mixed delivery, part of the program design is pay by enrollment, but also have formal policies in place to encourage regular attendance. And the real key thing is making sure that if a slot is going unoccupied, that mixed delivery partners are filling that slot. And so you've got kind of a cascading set of sort of after a certain number of absences, there's notification. Then the family and the coordinator are notified, right? Then they are reminded of expectations and told if they do not attend more regularly, that they will be disenrolled. And then ultimately, if they miss 15 days and they are disenrolled, and we quickly pivot and fill the slots. Again, recognizing, as I'll share, we've got about 1,000 kids on the mixed delivery wait list. And so really making sure if kids are not able to attend, first trying to address barriers, and our ready regions in partnership with our mixed delivery partners are well prepared to do that. But if that doesn't work, we got to fill that slot with a child and family who will take full advantage of it. And then VPI looks similar to K-12. It's pay by enrollment. We do student record collection 3 times a year through the student record collection system, fall, spring, and end of year. That's why we have some of the hot off the press data for you on VPI next. And outside of that, we have tried to work in partnership with our K-12 colleagues around making sure that we're paying attention to preschool attendance, developing strategies to highlight where kids aren't attending, and then doing outreach. I think there has been, under the leadership of Dr. Coons, a chronic absenteeism task force, and the sort of governor and the secretary and deputy secretary, a real effort kind of across K-12 systems to say, how do we kind of shift back to where we were, at a minimum pre-pandemic, of course, even, going beyond that. And we're trying to make sure that that those VPI kids are in classrooms as well. What we have heard anecdotally is that getting both, parents to pay attention to preschool and recognize it as important continues to be a challenge. It's sort of, it is not compulsory, and nobody's proposing that it is compulsory, but we do hear from our division partners that is part of the effort, is sort of helping folks understand that preschool attendance matters. Okay, with that, I will pause. Don't get very excited about the rest of the data. I'll bring back to you in a few minutes after your discussion. Back to you, Elliot. Oh, yeah, Dave, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jenna. And I just wanted to follow up, and I appreciate the pre-pandemic look back. That's really, really helpful in terms of seeing where we were and where we're going. I wanted to follow up on Delegate Campbell's report out, because she said something very important now that we're in November, and all of a sudden the session looks a lot closer than it was even last month, that they didn't have particular recommendations at this point, budget-wise or legislative-wise, for the 2025 session. And I just wanted to kind of confirm in your mind that there's too much going on at the federal level, and that we're safer not to make changes to either budget or legislative language at this point, and that we have the flexibility or the luxury of waiting for another year to be able to figure out how we're going to change those things. So just wanted to get a sense of whether that was we don't have anything now, or whether we are truly off the hook for the 2025 session with respect to making any changes.
So, yes, so I think that is, I think we would agree. I think we think it would be premature to put anything in legislation as it related to P by enrollment for CCSP for 2 reasons. One is we have permission to study other states and learn how this is working or not working. And 2, as a group that spent a lot of time looking at what is available through the current system, it's very shaky data. And we would feel much more confident, knowing that Kinder Systems was in place and that there was an ability to thread the needle in terms of the need to move to pay by enrollment, but also to create the appropriate set of incentives and consequences for attendance. For VPI and mixed delivery, both of the kind of attendance, most of the attendance content is covered in their guidelines, which you don't need budget language or legislation. And I'm nearly 100% confident that there's not anything that speaks to attendance in 12510 at this time, which is that budget section. So this group could recommend sort of shifts in those guidelines. So I'm not saying we can't do anything, but you don't need to do it in session. You could do that via this group, and then you could charge the department with making those types of changes.
Jen, I was with a group of business leaders the other day, and the discussion was on the impact of remote work and some efficiency issues. There's going to be a correlation to this eventually. And one of the things that we heard in that study is that there's a lot of inefficiencies in our at-home workforce when they're staying home because they elect not to take their child to childcare. When Kinder Systems gets running, will we be able to get data as to the reasons why absenteeism is there, beyond the health issues, which we naturally attribute to, but to understand, is there a permanent shift because of the remote work, the ability for people to, 3 days at home or 3 days in the office and 2 days at home? Will we be able to assess any of that data?
So it's an interesting question, Gary. I mean, certainly I remember talking with folks across the country during the pandemic and being like, you can't actually care for a small child and work, right? And there was consulting with somebody who was writing a brief on it, and they're like, well, parents find it difficult. I was like, it's not difficult. There's literally no way to intentionally be present with a small child and be fully at work. Yes, I mean, we're still in the design stage, so we can certainly think through what are the fields that we would ask for, and then also think about how do we make sure that we complete that information. I'll share a little bit later. We are going to share some information on employers. That was an open field, so it's been a lot of fun to sort through. 40,000 responses on how people spell where they work. But so we'll have to think about how we kind of capture that data in a way that's not an open field, so that it's meaningful. But that's it. We can definitely do that.
All right, so we do have some time for discussion at your tables, probably at least 10 or 15 minutes. I'll give you a warning when we need you to wrap up. But that, and maybe a little bit more than that, but that we want you to talk through what you've heard, both from study group 4 and from this attendance data, and share out any thoughts you have that we might want to put forward in our, in what we're transmitting to the legislature. So again, take a little bit of time. Please do appoint someone at your table who will be giving a brief report out on this, knowing that whoever that is going to have to come up and do it from the podium. So again, we're grateful for the volunteers. If anyone has any questions, be sure to ask the staff. But again, look forward to discussing. And if you want to, also, you should have sticky notes at your table. If you have any individual thoughts or anything that you want to make sure is captured, by all means, use those to facilitate that. We'll check back in a few minutes. All right, we are going to come back together and get report outs. And I told the green table they were going first, and I see that they are still furiously writing notes, which is awesome. But so we are going to go green, red, blue, virtual, yellow on this round, different order next round. So when the table ahead of you is presenting, if you could come up and be here so that we can keep things moving, that would be awesome. But come on up.
Good morning. We had some great conversation at our table. We decided that that we definitely need some type of attendance guidelines throughout the state. Also, we need consistent policy from early childhood to K-12, because sometimes we don't implement a lot of things in K-12, but those habits carry out through when those children get to the secondary level. So if you don't have an attendance policy early on, those kids tend to have the same type of attendance behavior throughout their whole schooling time. Then we need materials and training for parents and providers so that it won't be any guessing about what a policy or what a rule means. There'll be, documents to actually show people in detail what the rule is, what you do, what you can't do, because a lot of people read between the lines things that are really not there. So we need some type of materials for parents and providers to all be on the same page. And then we also said all providers should report to DSS when they have those chronically absent students. So then that way DSS can follow up with them and say, hey, you're receiving these DSS services, but your children are not in school. If your children don't start coming to school, you are at risk of losing your services. Because that moves a lot of students and a lot of parents. We actually started implementing something like that at our school this year, and it has helped us out a little bit when DSS sends them those letters saying, hey, your child has missed 15 days or 10 days. Why? Or, they try to help us to figure out why they're missing these days. And then we also stated that we should not move too quickly until after this next election to implement any legislation, because we don't know, which way we're going to move and what's going to happen down the road with that.
In my consulting, we say sometimes we just sit around and admire problems. Other times we solve them. We feel like we're still admiring the problem right now, right? We've gotten a lot of information. We don't necessarily know what to do with, but we completely agree with Jenna's comments around being able to get data and understand from other states. And obviously, as we clean up our data through Kinder, being able to understand that a little bit better to move towards solutions. One of our first topics, or even the main topic at our table, was just the challenges of the enrollment approach overall, and thinking about what guardrails or incentives need to exist in that approach. Even conversations around, I think this is Delegate Cherry's comment, can we think about co-pays in the context of some tie-in to attendance and actually being there? We know there's some challenges and potential debates with that, but thinking out of the box about how attendance and co-pays may be able to go hand in glove with that. And even challenging our consecutive days requirement and accumulated requirement and how the two of them mix. At our table, we learned that a lot of people know that, by the time you get to that 15th missed consecutive day, things happen. So we show up at day 13 or day 14 only to turn around and not show up again. So is there a way of blending the two? I think for me, listening to the table, one of the things that we heard that was impactful to me was Stacy's experience in Petersburg. Stacy, I won't have it exactly correct, so you can correct the language, but they have an enrollment agreement that requires the parents to sit with the school and talk about what the expectations are before their slots given up, to understand that you need to do these things. Here's the clarity around our expectations for you. And I don't think I had all the stats right, but there's a significant improvement in attendance and what they saw just from having this enrollment agreement. So we're really encouraged by that. I think that hits the highlights of what our table talked about.
And I think you guys have hit most of what we've talked about as well. But from our perspective, understanding the why, right? So we're all sort of have to be data driven in this. And from a fundamental perspective, it's not like putting your kid on the bus to go to elementary school. There's a transportation issue there. There's should I get on my remote work job and try to keep my baby at home and not miss out another day of work because I got up late and I'm late now? What's really behind the why of why they're not coming? And do they not understand the importance of it? Did something else happen? Is there a transportation issue? And the reporting out on the veracity of what we're getting for those reasons, understanding that might be an issue. Like when my employees call out, my tire's flat and I'm like, well, we'll come get you. But no, that's okay. I don't need you to come get me today. So there's something else going on. So understanding there's a veracity component to the why, and that where can we help and provide our providers with some additional resources to encourage attendance? I think what Stacy was talking about from a purpose of maybe your funding isn't tied. We can't use the stick, the carrot and stick. We don't have a stick we can use anymore because of what the federal government is doing from an enrollment perspective, from a payment perspective. But maybe as a provider, having those resources to say, yes, but from a provider perspective, when you don't come and you don't bring your child consistently, I'm going to replace your spot with someone else. Your funding may not go away, but I'm going to replace your spot because I need that spot for another child that's going to attend. And because from a provider's perspective, the day that we get a little low, that's great. We can send a few people home early. So there's an incentive from a provider perspective to occasionally have a few children not attend. But then when they have not attended for 3 or 4 days and they come back, they're completely different children. They're readjusting, they're crying at drop off, they're crying during the day, they're in addition to missing all of the great things that we're doing, it's a really hard adjustment. So re-incentivizing the provider to encourage attendance in a way that is both realistic and also provides them a benefit to be able to say it's important that they're there and they're there consistently. And then to skirt the line a little bit, can we skirt the line with what the federal rules say about this funding on some sort of a compulsory attendance? And again, if we have to backdoor it from a provider perspective and say, well, your funding is not going to go away, but your spot might. And I think that's where we ended up.
All right, next up, we'll hear from the virtual group.
All right, thank you. So we focused a lot on looking at the attendance as to why were families, not coming, and wondering if we could look at data in the future with more of the rationale behind why students aren't coming to school. And then we just kind of problem solved some different areas amongst our group that we thought could be issues. One of them was just scheduling, that since COVID, there's been a lot of different schedules amongst school systems. They don't necessarily follow federal and state holidays anymore. They've created their own days off, and that has really mixed family schedules up. So where children may be missing because schedules aren't consistent amongst the parties. We wonder how many of the absenteeisms are related to medical issues. So now that COVID is a long-term illness, how many of those absentees are they out because a family member themselves is out for 5-6 days in a row, which didn't exist before COVID, obviously. A little bit is this just a carryover of immune systems building back up as we get around each other more, and there's more children coming out of homeschooling situations and saying, I'd rather be schooled again because it's so tough to homeschool. We also talked about transitions. So there's a lot families today compared to 5 years ago move around a lot more. So they move around a lot more within their family situations, and they also move around a lot more just with the schedules from the families and the schools, and that they used to be able to learn from home, and now they're told to learn in person. And so maybe they're still thinking I can catch up if I just stay home and learn. There's not as much of a big need to be in school as there used to be. We also wondered about transportation, and that was more of just since COVID, the cost of transportation, the cost of vehicles has continued to escalate. So have repairs, and then with job schedules being not 9 to 5s anymore, is transportation an issue for families to come in because of multiple factors around that weren't there before COVID. The increase in mental health issues overall, obviously wondering if that applies to absenteeism, which a lot of times is the case. Also, we noted that the nation, 8% of the nation now has a 4-day work week. So we wondered if families weren't choosing to keep their child home on the 5th day, because that's a large portion of the workforce now, that not only are people working from home, but a lot of people who are working are only doing a 4-day work week, 8%. So overall, we were just wondering what was behind the absentee numbers and try to figure out a better reason so we can understand the overall situation a little bit better, admiring, as the other group said as well.
All right, thank you very much. We had some very similar conversations over at the yellow table. I guess from a legislative standpoint, we were relieved in some ways that we don't have the pressure of having to come up with budget or legislative language for 2025, and we got some time. Also really glad to see that we've got that data collection that's being actively done. I think that's going to be really, really important. So when it does come time to make those decisions, that we're operating off the best data possible. A couple of themes that we went through. Some of these are very similar to what was already discussed. And so, a lot of this relates to the co-payment issues that we've already discussed, making sure that there's enough skin in the game for families to value those services while also not making it cost prohibitive. And so ensuring that those things are linked. Finding the right balance between potential penalties and education, with the education part being the more important, but also the more challenging part of the equation, right? And I think at our table, and we've heard it before, is when you sit down with parents, sit down with families and talk about why this is important for their child, that is the main driver with respect to better attendance. But that also requires one-on-one kinds of interventions and conversations, and trying to do that statewide will require a lot of thought in order to be able to achieve successfully. We also talked about, very similar to the way that we approached the unemployment discussion at our last meeting that there needs to be some kind of consistent metric for raising that flag to say, hey, Houston, we have a problem. So that you're throwing that into the mix, but also recognizing, as was discussed before, that there's a lot of different reasons why a child might be absent, or you might have a temporary chronic absenteeism. And so while you have something that starts the process of really looking into what are those issues, that there's enough flexibility built into that process to recognize that each family is going to be very different, and that ultimately it's going to be the interest of the child that you want to keep in mind. And then finally, kind of, I think our last point was, the whole purpose of this is to ensure that working families who have a need for early childhood care and education are able to get those slots, and that those families that are willing to utilize those slots to the fullest ought to get priority. And so at some point, you need to have a mechanism to prioritize and make sure that those individuals are able to get those services if other families are not taking full advantage of those services.
Anybody have any questions they want to ask of other groups? All right, well, so to complete our admiration of the problem, it does seem as if there were a couple of consistent themes. I mean, everyone is struggling with the why, right? And that chances are it's it's all of the above, right? People identified any number of reasons why this might be happening, and that if you look broadly enough, they probably all contribute in some way. And one of the things that will be interesting is when we have better data to be able to get under the hood a little bit at potentially a community or even provider level and start to understand that why in a deeper way, because the whys, and again, people talked about a lot of different possible solutions, some of which were more policy oriented, some of which were more about communication and capacity building. And probably all of those will be necessary in some combination, but how those potential solutions fit with the data on what's actually happening is something that we're speculating about right now, but don't know quite yet. So this hopefully lays the groundwork for future conversations where we can come back and build on the foundation that's been built to really actually get at this in a new way once we have a better understanding of what's happening out there. So with great appreciation for that, we're now going to turn to our next conversation, and I'll welcome Jenna back up to talk about VPI enrollment and CCSP waitlists.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So this is a hodgepodge of data in an effort to make sure before our we complete our final meeting today that we've shared with you all the data that has been requested either via the study groups or via our in-person interactions. Next slide, please. So at your tables, just want you to know that you have the content sort of in the responses to the only unanswered questions that came out of our last meeting's conversation about co-payments. This is mostly the same as what you've seen before. Just one quick note is that we have recrunched the numbers. JLARC initially estimated that 2% of income was kind of the average amount currently being paid. Our analysis fully of FY24 reflects a slightly higher percentage, so about 2.6% of gross income overall. If you take out all of those families that are below the poverty line and just look at those parents that actually contribute a copayment, it is 3.3% of their gross income. So just wanting to kind of level set that we have shifted higher than where we were a year ago in terms of JLARC. The rest of this remains the same as what we shared with you last time. Next slide, please. We also, you've got this just so you have this as the kind of 3 examples that were shared last time, where we are now, what it would mean to double the current flat rate structure and add $5 a month for those under the poverty line, and then 7% for all, just so you've got this. We also, next slide. We're asked by you all to kind of say, what about some permutations? And so in a slide that will require you to put on your reading glasses in the appendices, we have the full scale so we're about 2.8 now, we've got 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, just ranges from sort of very few new slots at 3%, right? 55 across the state, which makes sense when you think about where we are now, at just right under that, up to 2,290 if you did 6% for all across the board. You all expressed an interest in saying, what about 7% for those above the poverty line, and then $5 a month for households below the poverty line? And so we wanted to kind of give you that number in the range. So if 3,030 was kind of the max new slots, birth to 5 slots at 7% for all, that going sort of this hybrid would provide just under that 2,435 birth to 5 slots. The other option, just helping you kind of norm well, if we kept our current flat rate structure and just added the $5 copayment for families under poverty, this would kind of put you right in that middle at roughly about 5% overall. So again, as you go into these final discussions, just you've got all of the permutations in the appendices, but really going from sort of current state, which is no additional slots, all the way up to the federally allowable max, which would be 7% for all, and then a few ranges to think about how you might want to do that across the different buckets. Next slide, please. Any questions on that before I move on? Yes, John.
Does the data show any correlation between the copay amount and attendance? We're all kind of making that assumption. I wonder if the data bears that out.
So I think the challenge is there's been so many changes. I don't know the exact scientific term for this, but there've been so many changes, both in terms of like externalities like the pandemic, and then the change in the rates of the co-payments. Remember, the co-payments, like, it'd actually be the opposite. If you just looked at the data, they'd be like, look, the co-payments went away and people stopped attending. There was also a global pandemic right at the same time that was probably skewing that more than the national kind of forgiveness of the co-payment. So I just don't know, John, that we've got any good data when I look at the last 6 years that would sort of suggest an ability to kind of draw a correlation.
You know what I'm gonna ask?
Yes.
So when I think in your microphone, you guys have done an amazing job.
Oh, microphone, I'm sorry. Yes, sorry.
The DOE and the legislator in funding subsidy and getting us to a reimbursement rate that is, significantly better than it's ever been. And we've made such great strides. And I think it's a goal that we all support to change that scale a little bit, to have some more family contribution. I think what we still have to put the sort of asterisks above is this is a 3-legged stool, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the government part of this that is providing some very public funds. There's the family part of it, and there's the provider part of it. And then we don't want to try to attempt to shift this to the family, and really the burden is going to be borne by the provider, who's not going to be able to collect, or who already doesn't collect either their full rack rate or tuition rate, or is writing off some portion because families are not paying. And so a little bit from the government is right. And so really we're shifting it not to the families, but to the providers, who are then not able to pay their teachers what they should be. So it's sort of this secular problem that we're in. And just to make sure we always asterisk this, we want to shift some of this to the families. Let's just make sure we're being careful with where the providers end up in that mix.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, and we've talked a little bit about this before, but as you're thinking about there's sort of 2 things to kind of keep in consideration. The first is the state never collects any copays, right? So functionally how this plays out, and you'll remember in the complexity of the data I shared last time, there's sort of what on paper you could collect versus what in actuality we discounted, because really it's the same as a discount on the rate, right? We take that assumed copayment off the top, and then that's what we paid providers, right? And then providers are on the hook for making up the difference. And if they charge more than the state, making up, both the copayment difference and the difference between the state rate and what they charge. I think the other piece just to consider, and why we wanted to sort of share where the flat rate was at, is dealing with flat rates, we have heard from providers, is operationally easier, right? And so just this idea of 7% is a way to maximize in concept based on income, but it also is sort of thinking about, is there a way to kind of get more from certain families, potentially sort of also address the fact that the flat rate is a little more consistent for providers in terms of there's a standard deduction off the top versus 42,719 different variations of that. All right, next slide, please. Or do you want to just move to keep going to the data?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Okay, so enrollment. So you remember we talked at the prior meeting, actually 2 meetings ago, about what we knew about all 3 of the state funded programs. And what we wanted to bring to you today is where we are on VPI. At that time, we knew where we were in terms of the child care subsidy wait list, the mixed delivery wait list, and we sort of said that school divisions had reported a significant number of waitlist slots, 8,975, but that we had some question about whether those were actual eligible families who would participate tomorrow if there were state funds available. And so what we want to loop back with you today is to sort of say what we know about enrollment. It has come in, it is nearly close to done. It still might move a little bit across our roughly 125 school divisions that take VPI, as we sort of making sure we're double checking every number. But what this data presents to you and kind of gives you a historical perspective, because what we're going to show you is that potentially looking at the historical rate of growth is maybe a more strategic way to think about VPI than kind of what are the self-reported wait lists. So we have 3 columns here, FY23, rows, FY23, FY24, and FY25. And VPI is quite a complicated section of the budget, but basically it has a formula that's codified in law. That formula spits out a number. Historically, I think for the entirety of VPI, that formula has always been way more slots than were actually used. So you'll see, for example, in FY25, that formula said there's 29,400 kids that would be eligible. The budget and adjustment, and huge thanks to our money committees who helped put this in place last year, in addition to the governor and General Assembly who signed off on this budget, said, we think it's going to actually be a little bit lower. And you'll see that last year was lower in this effort to not leave dollars on the table. It said, we're going to budget you, state, for 24,482 slots. We then go out, we say to the school divisions, how many slots do you think you serve? How many 4-year-olds? How many 3-year-olds? We put that all out. It came back and actually they said we need about 27,000 slots. We looked at sort of the reality of that number and we ultimately said, okay, we're not gonna be able to say yes to all of that. We're gonna look at historical data. We're gonna kind of analyze, do you have actual kids? We sort of went back and forth with school divisions from May until July, and then finally reallocated those 24,842 slots. Again, sort of, which is about 3,300 less than 3,400 less than what was asked for. As of actual enrollment this week, we are only seeing is about 23,133 children are enrolled in VPI right now. And this is that 3,397 is then sort of separate from the additional potential 8,975 kids that are on the wait list. There's some good news in this data. Thanks to tighter budgeting by the General Assembly and the governor, you'll see that our utilization is significantly higher in the prior years when you compare that 93% to the 86%. And you'll remember that we left between $20 and $30 million on the table each of those years. So we're closer, we're much closer, but there is, as we are finalizing this number, there might be up to $9 million in state general funds that could be reallocated as a result of that slight under enrollment in VPI. It also, as it sort of shows you that we want to sort of understand from school divisions where they sort of see potential growth, but also potentially treat that slightly differently than sort of saying, okay, we know that there are 3,397 kids that would otherwise have gone served if there's more state dollars. That data doesn't suggest that, right? The data actually suggests that we should look potentially at historical trends for growth for VPI as a way of measuring actual demand versus kind of more conceptual demand. Next slide, please. I know this is a lot and a little bit of a crash course in VPI, but basically just sort of, we keep sort of saying we've got to kind of run the request and see where there is the desire for growth, but also temper that with what we see in actual utilization. So the blue line graph here is the total enrolled. What you see very positively is we've basically been able to get back and slightly above pre-pandemic numbers in VPI. It's not necessarily true in kind of K-12 and our other education arenas, but it's certainly true in VPI. So you see pretty significant growth as we came out of the pandemic. The orange line is 4-year-olds only. What this is saying is, though there's some overall growth, really a lot of that growth is driven by divisions that are interested in 3-year-olds, right? And we added to the budget a few years ago. You can apply for 3-year-olds. We use the same pot of money, right? So there's been enough, even though we said no to 3,000 requests last year, we did say yes to a lot of 3s and a lot of 4s. And folks are really taking advantage. School divisions, I was just out in Southwest Virginia this week, a lot of work around sort of serving 3-year-olds, particularly in some of those childcare deserts or places that don't have any other options. In contrast, 4-year-olds came back right after the pandemic and then have really flattened out and even sort of slightly lower this year in terms of the 4-year-old enrollment compared to last year. Next slide, please. In what might be my favorite graph, but probably hardest to discern, basically what this shows is, although the formula is codified and we have to follow the formula, and we really appreciate the ability to kind of receive requests from school divisions for 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds. And certainly when you think about moderate 3-year-old growth, the structure that you all have, that our General Assembly has put forth for us works. We should really be thinking about, as we assume what number we want in the budget, looking at kind of that historical growth as probably the biggest predictor. So the blue line is the formula, the green line is the budget. So you sort of see the formula has kind of gone up and down. The formula is the one that is tied, and it's in your slides, to kindergarten enrollment and at-risk kind of qualifications minus the Head Start slot. So that's the one that sort of accounts for birth rate. And that the green line is we've sort of made some investments and we were sort of potentially a little slightly over-invested and left a lot of dollars on the table. And then the orange line is the slots requested. And so while we're excited that school divisions are interested in serving as many kids as possible, we're just seeing that there's potentially some enthusiasm there that's not actually reflected in terms of what, kind of parents actually signing up and doing this. And so again, noting that the kind of yellow line is a fairly predictable sort of growth rate and might be, sort of a better way to think about, what are the needed VPI slots for FY26 relative to the kind of the wait lists that have been collected by school divisions. Yes.
So I love this chart too, very, very much. It speaks to me, but and I can understand how a formula in the code can consistently provide data that's off the mark, right? It's a something that was crafted in a period of time or a snapshot in time, and then it kind of keeps spitting out, data based on understandings at a particular point in time. I'm interested in why, though, the slots requested are so consistently higher, right? And so I can see where, that might happen for a while, and then they should kind of move in the same direction as actual slots filled. But I do the school districts say, hey, it's going to be different this year, and then it's not? I'm just curious whether you've gone back and tried to figure out, because I totally agree that historic trend provides a much better number for budgeting, and yet I hate to totally divorce that from needs assessments, because that helps to kind of ground where you're at. But it's just so consistent that they're off. And I'm really interested in understanding why that is.
No, I appreciate that, Delegate. So it's something we've actually been looking really closely at. So when we received the request for over 27,000 slots this year, and we knew we could only fund just under 25,000, we really scoured those numbers and basically kind of went back and said, hey, you asked us for this. Let us present to you your 3-year historical usage. This is what we are suggesting. You call us if you have actual kids, right? So if your 3-year average was 100 and you actually have 102 kids, call us and let us know. And we kind of negotiated that through to kind of get a better understanding of what it is. I think a part of it is this is kind of always how it's been done. I think a part of it is there's might as well, if you talk to, the budget folks, might as well overestimate, right? And that way, it comes in. And then I just think, what we learned this summer by that kind of exercise of trying to kind of really right size is, we had back and forth with some of our larger school divisions that have historically not used all their slots to say, hey, like we have a small rural division that wants to ask for 6 slots and is like, got those kids ready to go. And like your 110 number seems slightly unrealistic. Can we adjust it down to like 90, for example? And they were willing to do that. So I think it is about sort of putting some of this data back in front of folks, saying like there's a kind of a collective good around not over asking, right? Because now there's been no reason not to over ask up until this point, and then trying to kind of ground people in that sort of more realistic data. Folks also, somebody would sort of say to us like, hey, we weren't sure what was going on with this, particular school or situation, so we over asked for a little bit. And what's striking by that is, we've heard, and I'm, looking at, at Todd out here, we've heard like that's like, there's also kind of like, how do we make sure the system where it's real does give you the ability, right, to ask for more slots. If you're sure you're going to open a new pre-K sort of center in the next year, right? If you have 3-year-olds coming on. And so I think the answer, and you guys are going to be shocked to hear this, I think a part of it is putting this data back in front of people and saying like, if you have a legitimate new school, new reason, new community opening, like, yes, like we can go above your historical average, but if this is just a cushion and we want you to kind of get more real, and maybe what I'm imagining, Delegate, is just another round between the 125 school divisions and us around trying to kind of ground them in the actual data and be a little bit more realistic in their predictions.
Just a question, why is there a wait list if you have the budgeted slots, you have 93% filled?
So a part of this is the folks, so there's 2 things that are going on there. One is there's a desire to offer slots, and there might be families there, but like, for example, they all might want to be at the same elementary school, and there's only 1 classroom and 18 slots there, right? So that there is some sort of the wait list is kind of the inefficiencies across the system, right? So we might give a particular county 100 slots, but really the most popular elementary school is this one. And so you've got a wait list of 20 kids here that don't want to travel to any of the other sort of sites, for example. So that's another one. The other one is we still do have places where there's just not enough physical space. They can't find a teacher, right? So that they could get, more slots, but this was a self-reported wait list from the school divisions. And I am imagining, Commissioner, there's a little bit of that inflating as well in terms of like, aspirationally, here's what we'd love to do. It's just not necessarily grounded in actual kids that are ready to go. We also know in some of the data that I shared with you all earlier that just under 1,000 kids and families said, we can't do VPI. The kind of the structure of the academic year just doesn't work for us in terms of the need for more full coverage.
Jenna, question. In higher ed, in K-12, we talk about these enrollment cliffs that are coming. Do we foresee, is there any way to predict what that's going to look like in early childhood education?
Yeah, I think if you think about this, if you were to go back 1 slide, I think this is why the blue and orange slide is so important. I mean, I think like if you were asking me and I were a betting person, I'd say like we're probably gonna be about 25,000 slots for VPI next year, right? That's probably where you are. If you look at this growth, again, I would want to make sure we had some ability to say like, if you've got a new center, right? If there's some kind of change, right? If if some program is closing, right? I think that's right. I think you're going to still want to account for some growth in 3-year-olds just because it's such a low percentage overall. But I think kind of we are out of like what is the sort of pandemic drop and return, and you're probably going to see outside of sort of a handful of like new schools and kind of growth, like this is probably pretty solid. When you look back at the birth rates, they're pretty sort of consistent, right? Lower than they were a decade ago, just under 100,000 kids a year. So I imagine that the rate of growth for VPI will be fairly stable for 4s, and where the real kind of question mark is 3s, and how do we get places that have space to kind of embark in serving 3s. All right. Okay, here's where we are on waitlists for early childhood. So a shift in this slide overall, again, as I said before we thought because of the initial data available to us that we had waitlists across the programs, as we see right now that VPI is actually sort of slightly under enrolled with about 1,709 slots going currently unused. With this, what this does shift is kind of a slight shift in the picture around total demand. This makes sense when you think about some of the macroeconomic factors, but now we're up to about 71% of demand coming from public-private settings and about 29% of demand for the public school settings. So again, this continues to be a pretty significant trend, which would align with workforce participation and just the number of kids under the age of 6 of all available parents in the workforce. The other piece, we've begun to look at the sort of where there might be some duplication across wait lists, at least based on what we've received from mixed delivery and childcare subsidy. It's very, very low, less than 5%, and we'll continue to monitor that. Next slide, please. So here's what we know about childcare subsidy. As of October 27th, there's 11,129 children on the childcare subsidy list. Again, 8,000 of those birth to 5, and that's about 70% of that wait list. Still, the single biggest factor is our infant toddler. And as a reminder, they cannot be served, by BPI. They can only be served by childcare subsidy and mixed delivery. We are pretty solid in terms of the number of localities that have a wait list. Mostly smaller localities, with the exception, I will say, of Fairfax, which has just made some pretty significant local investments still. And so these are all kind of outside of Fairfax in terms of what's driving these wait lists. This is also put on your reading glasses. It's in the very last page in the appendix. And then the growth of rate has slowed. And so while we're sort of the 8,000 number is our birth to 5 total. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see is that the kind of actual, or 2 slides down, we'll talk about in growth. Per capita, you'll see that when you look at the childcare, the number of kids on the wait list as a percentage of the 42,719 slots, you'll see a pretty sort of consistent in terms of a pretty significant, about a quarter to a third, roughly. Capital area is low. That is really driven by the local investments made by the Fairfax Office for Family and Children's Services. This is the growth rate chart. And so orange is infant, toddler, and preschool. So birth to 5, taking us up from 2,000 when we first started tracking up to just under 8,000. And then blue is all children. So that reflects school age included. Blue looks like it's growing at a slightly higher rate. A part of that is because birth to 5 is the priority for kids coming off the wait list via attrition, right? So it's not a lot of kids coming off via attrition, but if they are, they're birth to 5. And so we're chipping away more at the orange, and you're going to see more school age children sitting for longer on the wait list because birth to 5 is the priority and has been the kind of priority expressed of this group. But you'll see we went from kind of radical 3-digit growth at the beginning to a solid kind of 14% for birth to 5, 15% overall for the kind of month of October. 2 data requests just to have for final conversation. We sort of said, can you give us sort of all the information on the wait list? The actual parent employment on the wait list is not sort of capturable easily. I wouldn't necessarily, this is easily. So as I said before, this is an open-ended field. So we can type in, and if you want to know 100 different ways to spell out Virginia Tech, I can give them to you now. But Polytechnic, VT, this and that, VA Tech, Virginia Technology, it's the whole thing. But we have incredible partners, folks on our team and at UVA, who have helped us go through and look at this and kind of bucket them by industry. Couple of really big factors. I saw it was so appropriate that Todd was speaking yesterday because health continues to be one of the biggest participating programs. It makes sense when you think about sort of the enormity, the need. They just can't rely on something like BPI, right, with the schedules that parents have, but across the state. Education is next. 97 out of the 131 school divisions have folks that are participating, so where our sort of folks are listed, employees are listed as childcare subsidy participants. We've got a lot of childcare, as we talked about before, in addition to higher education. Next, it's a broad other, but kind of manufacturing, construction, again, in person. You'll notice a theme here. These are, unlike Gary's example, these are almost all in-person jobs. Huntington Ingalls, Dominion Energy, Smithfield, Wells Fargo, Capital One, Purdue. As you might imagine, retail, Amazon is our single largest employer, closely followed by Walmart and some few others, then accommodations, food service, and then a little bit of surprise to us, the other kind of big bucket was government, ranging from sort of federal government down to actually quite a lot of local government as well. Again, I think the big takeaway here is it's an incredible long curve in terms of how many different folks, but some real themes have emerged in terms of health, education, and really in-person employers for the most part across the state. Arguably also, fairly essential in many, it would range depending on your definition of essential, but I think Amazon is essential, but across the list as well. And we had a request, next slide, please, on family composition. And I think one of the things that we've talked about, we talked quite a bit about last time, is really thinking about how do we prioritize school age versus birth to 5. We have a robust measurement and improvement system for birth to 5. There are very few other options. There's no other options for infant and toddler versus we have Boys and Girls Club, 21st Century. A lot of our city governments and county governments get involved in after school. There's a lot more sort of subsidized after school options available for school age as compared to birth to 5. And as I said before, infant toddler numbers are leading the way. The one thing just to note, when you look at the family composition, and this is cases, not children, what you see is the 40% of the cases of sort of that involve school age children also involve young children, right? And so it's not like these are sort of two separate groups. Only about 28% of cases or households are school age only. So again, it's a balancing act when you think about, okay, we want to prioritize birth to 5. That is the priority for the wait list, but also recognizing that there's a kind of a sort of a mix in terms of birth to 5 and school age. Next slide, please. Okay. Also wanted to kind of close the circle on mixed delivery and an update on waitlist here. We previously came to you in September with some initial numbers that suggested about 2,100 kids. We have worked very closely with the foundation and our 9 Ready Region partners who in turn are working with our private providers. And we have an adjusted number. So this number right now, it's still dynamic, still changing, slightly lower, about 996 children, but these have been vetted, right? So again, I know so many numbers have been going back and forth, but we know the 11,000 children or the 8,000, birth to 5 kids on the child care subsidy list are real, exist, are ready to go tomorrow. And we feel very confident that the 996 children, birth to 5 children on the mixed delivery wait list are real, have been verified, not just interest, but actually eligible and want to participate. Again, you're not going to be surprised to see this. 61% of the wait list is infant and toddler. And then the rest are preschool. Overall, this represents about 40% of all of the mixed delivery slots. It's a smaller program, about 2,500 kids right now. And we will continue to monitor this wait list up until the time that we get to session. And as I said before, very little duplication across the child care subsidy and mixed delivery wait list. This gives you kind of the sense. These numbers, again, look much higher, but just remember the size of the program is much smaller. So North Central just really this is a kind of an example of a place that really wants to grow mixed delivery, right? And so they've been recruiting and they've got all these families that are interested. They probably had a smaller base, as did Capital, than some of these other areas. But again, you'll see a little bit more of a range here, which would make sense in terms of a smaller program. But you got 1,000 kids across the state and families that are interested in this program, and we're only able to serve about 2,500 right now. Okay, so the last piece, and I know we've sort of heard this in bits and pieces, but as you reflect on the different data elements that we've shared with you, we just kind of wanted to put in one place what we've heard from the groups, right? And I know we've heard a lot of this even this morning, but and wanted to kind of put this out in a slide. If there are, you've got your Post-its and we'll have a final discussion. If there's things that don't resonate or that you would want to add more to, this is our time to do this, but we want to kind of make sure that we're fully, as we go off in partnership with Elliot and the foundation and Deputy Secretary Galickson and the Secretary's office, making sure we've got kind of a clear sense of the broad directional responses to the, many data slides that I've shared. With the real question being, will I be invited back next year to share data, or whether this has all been too much for you? But we've heard, right, addressing the wait list is got to be, with the eligible working families, has got to be the priority. We know we have a challenge, and Benita said it much more elegantly than me, around how do we maximizing this need to kind of potentially have reasonable co-payments and bring in a little bit more from families, but also, ensuring that there's not an unintended negative consequence for providers. You've encouraged us to think differently about the different sort of structures when we particularly think about, families that are under the level of poverty. And I know we heard this from Delegate Bulova and his work group, that if there are resources made available as a result of higher co-payments, how do we prioritize for birth to 5 early childhood efforts? We've heard that there is an interest in reasonable limits on how long a parent can search for work, because we want to prioritize working families with some flexibility for extraordinary circumstances, but making sure that with our scarce slots, they go to families and kids who need them most. We talked a lot about attendance and sort of thinking about, again, how do we have the consistent and predictable revenue, but we need kids to be in programs participating. We need to reduce barriers, as Simon described from our virtual working group, and making sure that families and kids are benefiting. And then we weren't, I know because of the need to shorten today, we didn't get to talk much about innovation, but as somebody who was able to see an innovative model made possible by Ready Region Southwest and Ballot of the Tri-Share this week out in Abington with Dr. Coons and our DOE leadership cabinet, that also has to be a part of the solution, and thinking about engaging philanthropy and business and parents, and kind of, thinking about do we have enough supply, and looking at kind of capital investments, but that continues to be a theme throughout what we've heard from you. So any questions about the wait lists, mixed delivery, any of those other things I've just shared with you, the industries?
Thank you, Jenna. And as always, that's a great way of distilling a lot of data, and really appreciate it. I think in terms of the summary of findings, you nailed that. Going back to the wait lists, one of the questions I had, so I'm glad to see that the wait lists are coming down, if I understood your data correctly, to that 900 plus level. I guess the one kind of outstanding data point, and I didn't know if we had better data or updated data, or whether we still need to wait, is how long you need to stay on that wait list before you cycle through, right? Because there's a big difference. You got a 900 person wait list, but if you're only on that wait list for a month, maybe that's tolerable, as opposed to somebody who's going to be on that wait list for 6 months, in which case that's really difficult for a family to navigate. And so do we have a better sense of how long they are on that wait list? And then I guess in your mind, realizing that you're always going to have a wait list, what is the longest you could be on that wait list? And what is kind of our target?
Yeah. So we could go back to the slide with the waitlist, CCSP waitlist group. So we don't know much about the 996 for mixed delivery. I will say, as we are working very close with our partners to kind of get an understanding of who's real, who's there, when they came on, and then looking at those attrition rates, which again are going to be smaller in terms of a program of 2,500. If you'll look at the kind of rate of growth here, Delegate Bullock, you do see that we are moving more kids so as kids are adding, the reason that rate of growth is slightly slower is that any of the attrition is going to birth to 5, right? So, there's kind of look, it's kind of a 1% sort of high level difference, which is about, and that's 1% of the wait list, not 1% of the overall population, but that sort of reflects, that there is some movement happening from sort of families that went on the wait list in July or August and then are getting served. It is highly variable across the 133 localities. And so there are cases where we saw some blip in terms of movement where kids were potentially going to school and parents weren't interested in the kind of the after school options. Let's suppose you were at a family childcare program that only served kids kind of up to 5, right? And so you completely came off the program. So there was some activity right around back to school. We've also heard of places that are, that sort of, there's some of it has been job change circumstances. And then some of it has been more like, I'm, moving, or this kind of, I'm not interested in participating in this community anymore, but it just continues to be a very low rate of attrition in terms of families that are kind of coming off the program each month. And again, you'll see it's clearly happening there, right? Because probably the rate of coming on is the same, if not more for infant and toddler, but we're able to cycle some of those through. So we also have a small, I think it's like between 1% and 2% of families who say, you know what, take me off the wait list. Like I'm just going to opt out of working. And I think that is the other trend that is emerging as we hit multiple months here, that it just doesn't make sense for me to be on this wait list. I think, Benita said it best, like you can't serve. And I think some families are trying to make it right, with 100% copayment, right? Like cover the cost. But that is the other thing, is that they receive a monthly letter from their local office and they are kind of calling back and saying, I can't work right now, so I'm going to opt out of this.
Well, thanks to Jenna for that incredibly dense presentation. Hopefully next time we'll have a slide that does actually include all the things that Virginia Tech personnel call their employer. And if the UVA people call it something else, like keep it to yourself. We only have a few minutes to talk at your tables, but please do take some time. Please designate someone who can report out, and then we will do that in some different order that I'll tell you in advance. If you have anything you want to put on sticky notes for further follow-up, please do that. A couple of other housekeeping notes. First of all, if there's anyone in the room or online who would like to offer public comment, please let the staff know so that we can plan accordingly. Secondly, if you are in the room and you really absolutely need to scoot right at noon, we do have the lunches in the back, so you can go grab those. If it's possible to wait until noon and focus on the conversation right now, please do. But if you absolutely need to get rolling and you need to grab your lunch to eat it now, by all means, go ahead. We will reconvene in a few minutes and then wrap up. Yeah, so we're just asking people to react and reflect on everything you just heard in this last presentation about co-payments, wait lists, and enrollment, which I know is an awful lot, but please just take a few minutes to synthesize that. All right, I'm sorry to cut things short, but we do want to end on time. So this time, let's have the virtual group report out first, and then we'll go blue, yellow, red, green. And again, if you can come up and be on the side to be ready to report out when the previous group is talking, that would help speed things along. But virtual group, if you could please go ahead.
They're still getting back into it. 44.
Are they still doing that?
Yeah, it just takes, Zoom a minute. Yeah, exactly.
Want to get one of the other groups too?
Yeah, blue group, can you come?
Blue group.
Blue, that's.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Apparently that's green.
I think for our purposes, it's been a lot of admiring the problem, as was so eloquently said earlier. And from my perspective from the provider, which to say, creating some data, gathering data, in particular to make sure that that third leg of the stool in the providers is not weakened to the extent that shifting some of the balance isn't just to shifting the balance at the expense of your providers who are we're always chasing the copay as it is. And so now if you're going to shift more of that burden to just gather enough data to realize what the problem really looks like. If we're going to shift it towards the 3 to 6%, some other percentage number, we want to make sure that it's realistic and that it is being collected and that your providers aren't struggling, because Virginia has made such great strides in the cost of care and what the reimbursement rates look like. If we shift it now, make sure that it's still being collected, that there's a way or a mechanism there to be able to make sure that the investment that we are all attempting to make to ensure the largest number of children can be served, that we're not doing that in a way that is at the cost of your providers and their teachers and down the line, that it's not a trickle-down effect or an unintended consequence.
Is the virtual group ready to go? All right, well, maybe let's go with the yellow group then. And we'll just do red next and then green and then virtual.
Okay, so I think in general, with most of the summary responses, I think our table agrees with all of those. Prioritizing birth to 5, 7%, copay, 7% of income as copay, the job search limit, and then moving towards, encouraging attendance by allocating slots to families that do attend. One thing on the innovation piece of this that I'd like to see some more specificity maybe next year around what are the different models that employers actually contribute to the child care subsidy. So, I'm aware that Kentucky, for example, has a significant employer contribution requirement in their program. So it'd be interesting to see what other states are doing around that employer contribution. What are the different models that we could actually ask? That was a really interesting slide, by the way, of all the different employers that take advantage of this program. But it'd be great to actually go to those employers and say, hey, how could you contribute and step up? And so what's the model that Virginia is going to use to have that conversation going forward? I think that would be a great contribution.
Our table leaned into a little bit more of the types of poverty in different parts of Virginia, the access to information, the access to understanding CCSP, availability of slots in those spaces. In particular, in Southwest Virginia and in Region 7, a slot that's 10 miles away might take 45 minutes to get to, in a place where in Newport News, a slot that's 10 miles away, you might know about immediately because you have a community resource center. They're connecting you to that information. They're helping you get enrolled. And so one of the things that our table really talked about is the communication tools, access, and the importance of building those networks and those resource networks, in particular our rural areas.
All right, we focused a lot on the co-payment slides. And so we really felt like slide 3 was a good compromise that builds off of a lot of the feedback from work groups last time. But we did note that the co-pays are now by family instead of per kid. And so we were curious with Jenna's modeling skills, what that 0 to 100% FPL would be if it was $5 per kid instead of $5 per family, because you've shown your data skills are off the chart. We also were very supportive of the job search reasonable limits that were identified in the summary slide, and then really intrigued by the yellow line on the VPI formula of modeling for that historical growth as our predictor moving forward.
Great. And hopefully the virtual group.
Yeah. Just couldn't find my mute button before, but I think our group was just impressed by the diverse data that was displayed here, and took a little bit for us to kind of find some through lines, I would say. But again, talking with the predictors and projected growth, we're interested in a little bit more of how that formula works out. And also that the wait list is definitely skewed towards the infant and toddler. So just recognizing that any sort of workforce growth would need to account for those smaller class requirements in those classrooms specifically as well.
Great. All right. Thank you all for a brief but fruitful discussion, and I will turn it over to Gary to take us home.
Thank you again, everyone, for your participation. A couple of housekeeping items. First of all, and Deputy Secretary mentioned this earlier, we have a report due December the 1st. And so as we did with the report for October, if you'll allow the steering committee to work together on reviewing and providing feedback on that, once it's completed, we'll certainly provide that to the members of the commission as we have. So just FYI on that. Secondly, we're aware of no one that desires public comments today, but I'll pause for a second just to make sure. Last time we found out afterwards that someone wanted to do that. Anyone signed up for public comments that we're aware of? Nope. Okay, so let's finish up our time together. We were reflecting, particularly Kathy, as she was doing some planning for this, reflecting on a year ago what we were thinking about in this room. And a year ago, we were concerned about 30,000 plus children that might lose access to quality care, affordable childcare, et cetera. Well, 1 year later, one General Assembly session, 6 commission meetings, we aren't thinking about that issue anymore. And we're grateful for that. And thanks to the leadership of a lot of people, including the individuals in this room, for the work around that. Do we need to figure out how to take care of this wait list issue? Absolutely. Appreciative of the time and input that you've had on that. Do we need to continue to work together to make sure that what's been built endures for the future? Yeah, absolutely. So we're not ready to rest on our laurels, but I do think it's important for us to take a pause and just to be a little celebratory as we think about the progress that's been made. And I know that we all have a lot of confidence in our administration, our members of the General Assembly, private sector champions, members of this commission, and a lot of interested people to make sure that we will continue that charge as we go forward. But I just want to thank this group in particular for their work. Earlier, the charge for the commission was read to you. I won't reread the entire part of it, but I would like to read the emphasis. The charge of our commission was to provide recommendations for tracking progress on the financing of a comprehensive birth to 5 early childhood care and education system. I believe this commission has leaned into that charge very, very well. And in fact, when you step back and look at it, we've delivered and helped deliver with a lot of other people a robust system that does the 3 things that we said we were going to do: support school-ready children, work-ready parents, and economically thriving communities. And I believe this commission has played a significant role in achieving those 3 things. So thank you again to Delegate Coiner as the leader of the commission, to all the members of the General Assembly who have worked together in a bipartisan and collaborative way, to the members of our administration from data input leadership throughout the Commonwealth, to the ECF and other organizations that have been so involved in this over the years. And again, to all of you who are members of the commission. So enjoy a few months away from meetings, and we'll look forward to getting back together again. And finally, as was recognized, for those that participated will no longer be part of the commission going forward, a special thank you to you. Have a great weekend, and thanks for your work. And members of the General Assembly will look forward to your work this session as well. Thank you very much.